All right, everybody, welcome back to another deep dive with us. Today, we are going to tackle a topic that I think everybody has kind of thought about at some point. Do we really have control over our own actions? I mean, you chose to click on this episode, right? You
Mhm.
chose what you were going to do next. That feeling of being the captain of your own ship is really powerful.
It is. We kind of live our lives as if we're the authors of our choices, from what we eat to bigger life decisions. This intuition that we have free will really shapes how we see responsibility, morality, and even like the laws of our society.
Exactly. But get this, things get a little bit more complicated. Science and philosophy have started to ask some serious questions about our freedom of choice. There's actually a really popular book by a Stanford neurobiologist named Robert Sapolsky. It's called Determined, A Science of Life Without Free Will. And his central thesis is pretty shocking. Science shows that free will is actually an illusion.
Yeah, his main argument is that everything we do is actually the inevitable outcome of a ton of events that we are not consciously controlling. Think about it. Our life history, the environment we grew up in, our genes, hormones, culture, it all kind of programs us to act in a specific way with no room for genuine choice in the moment.
And he doesn't stop there. If our behavior is determined, then nobody is really morally responsible for what they do. He even suggests that while we might need to lock up criminals for the safety of everyone, they don't actually deserve to be punished in the traditional sense. That's a pretty radical view. So if we take his argument to the extreme, then every single choice we make, like even scratching your nose, was already written in the stars from the Big Bang. It really messes with our sense of self, right?
It's a pretty radical view. And what's even more interesting is that only a minority of philosophers actually agree with Sapolsky's strong stance. Research shows that most philosophers actually believe that causal determinism, this idea that everything has a cause, can coexist with free will and moral responsibility. So does that mean those philosophers just don't get the science? Or is Sapolsky's view of free will so narrow that he is ignoring some important philosophical perspectives?
Yeah, that's the puzzle that we're going to try to unpack today. So for those of you tuning in, our mission in this deep dive is to understand the arguments from both sides. From those who deny free will based on science and philosophy, to those who defend some form of agency, even in a universe that might be fundamentally determined, we're going to explore those ideas, maybe have some of those aha moments that we love, and do it all without taking sides. We just want you to leave this with a clear understanding of a debate that has been going on for centuries.
Exactly. So to start untangling this knot, I think it would be useful to define the basic terms. What do we mean by free will and determinism?
Yeah. So from what I have gathered, free will at its core is our ability to choose between different courses of action. Like when you're looking at a menu and you're like, pizza or pasta, we feel like we have those two real options and can go either way.
Exactly. That's that intuitive notion of free will as the ability to have done otherwise in that exact situation. Now, determinism, on the other hand, is this idea that all events, including our actions and decisions, are inevitably caused by prior events following the laws of nature. In other words, given the state of the universe at one point in time, only one future is possible.
And that's where things get tricky, right? If everything we do is the inevitable result of this chain of causes, then do we really have that freedom to choose? It's like we are following a predetermined cosmic script.
That's the first objection that comes to mind. If everything is just the consequence of a long chain of causes, then our feeling of choice would just be an illusion. But that's where the compatibilists come in with an interesting counter-argument. They use this analogy, which I thought was really helpful. Imagine that you are locked in a room, but you actually don't want to leave because you're really engrossed in reading a book. Even though you don't have the option to leave, your decision to stay and read still feels like a choice, right? The lack of alternatives in this case doesn't necessarily negate your will or your decision.
Oh, I see. So for compatibilists, the main point isn't whether there are other options, but how the decision arises within you. Even if that decision is the result of various causes, if it stems from your own desires, beliefs, and thoughts, it can still be considered a form of free will.
Right. And this is where they sort of poke at Sapolsky. Philosopher John Martin Fisher argues that Sapolsky doesn't really explain why his specific definition of free will, the one that's incompatible with determinism, is the only one that matters when we are talking about moral responsibility. Sapolsky just kind of assumes that if determinism is true, then there's no free will and therefore no one is morally responsible. But he doesn't really engage with the other ideas of free will that philosophers have been debating for centuries.
So what's the compatibilist take on moral responsibility in this determined world?
They believe that human beings are agents who act for moral reasons, who understand right and wrong. and that this capacity is enough for us to have a degree of freedom and responsibility for our actions, even if those actions are ultimately determined. They make a crucial distinction. Being determined is not the same as being physically coerced. For example, not saving a drowning child because you are tied up is different than not saving a drowning child because you simply don't care. The first situation is an excuse. The second one is grounds for moral condemnation, even though both could be seen as determined by prior causes.
I get it, but the incompatibilists would probably have a response to that, right? They would say that even our reasons, desires, and beliefs are caused by factors that we don't control, which ultimately undermines any idea of true freedom.
That's the backbone of the incompatibilist argument. They question this idea that an action can be considered free if the very motivations behind it are the result of a causal chain that comes from things outside our control. For them, even if the decision to not help the child comes from within you, this you, was also shaped by a series of determined events.
And then we kind of reach an impasse, right? Compatibilists saying that the lack of options isn't the key point, but whether the action comes from you in a relevant way, even if that you is determined. And incompatibilists insisting that if everything has a cause, then there's no room for true freedom.
Exactly. They have fundamentally different views on what really matters for defining free will. Compatibilists use the analogy of a tree falling in the forest. One person might say that there is no sound if no one hears it, while another will say that the sound exists as a vibration in the air, regardless of whether someone is there to listen to it. In the same way, they disagree on which factors are crucial for the existence of free will. As philosopher Daniel Dennett asks, what varieties of free will are worth wanting?
That makes me wonder if this whole debate isn't primarily a scientific question. I mean, science can tell us about how the brain works and how decisions are made, but the very definition of free will and its relationship to moral responsibility seem to be more philosophical questions.
That's a key point. The definition of free will is a metaphysical question. It deals with the nature of reality, and its connection to moral responsibility is normative. It involves what we consider right and wrong. While science can inform these discussions, they are not at their core purely scientific questions. The mistake that some people make, as Sapolsky seems to do according to some critics, is assuming this is a question that can be settled just by looking at what science says without considering the long philosophical debate that has already taken place.
And it's a debate that has been going on for quite a while, right? From what I have read, philosophers have been debating this question of free will for thousands of years.
Exactly. And it continues to be a central theme in contemporary philosophy. Modern thinkers like Sam Harris advocate a strong deterministic view, arguing that free will is an illusion that we maintain as a society, maybe even with dangerous consequences like blaming people too much. On the other hand, Daniel Dennett, as the compatibilist, suggests that free will can exist in degrees even within a determined reality. He argues that maybe thinking in absolutes, either we have total freedom or we have none, might not be the best approach. He uses the analogy of truth. Just like we can have different degrees of truth, even if absolute truth is unattainable, maybe we can have different and important degrees of freedom, even if absolute freedom isn't possible.
That idea of degrees of freedom is interesting, but I can't help but think about the practical and emotional impact of actually believing that we don't have free will. I read this kind of disturbing story about philosophers who received threatening emails from someone who felt like their life had been ruined by this idea that nobody is responsible for their own actions.
That's a powerful illustration of the personal impact this debate can have. For some people, denying free will can be really unsettling, leading to feelings of hopelessness and even justifications for bad behavior. Saul Smolansky, a philosopher who thinks that the popular idea of free will is a mistake, talks about solutionism, the idea that it might be crucial for people to continue believing in free will, even if it is an illusion, because the truth might be too depressing and destructive. He even mentioned that if a student prone to depression wanted to study this topic with him, he would try to dissuade them. To be clear, illusionism here is not about malicious deception. It's about the idea that believing in the illusion of free will could be better for society as a whole.
Wow, that's heavy. So there's a real fear that if people truly believe that they are not responsible for their own actions, it could lead to a kind of moral decay.
It's a common concern. If we're not free to choose, then why bother trying to do the right thing? Why feel guilty for our mistakes or proud of our accomplishments? The very fabric of our relationships, which often relies on this idea of choice and responsibility, could be shaken.
This takes me to another line of thinking that I came across, the idea of a mechanistic universe. If everything is governed by cause and effect, including what happens in our brain, It seems like there's no room for that contra-causal kind of free will, right? That ability to have chosen differently, even with the exact same prior conditions. To use a more technical term, contra-causal means that for a choice to be truly free in that stronger sense, you'd have to be able to choose something else, even if everything beforehand, right down to the exact state of your brain, were identical. It implies a break in that chain of cause and effect.
Exactly. That's a view that goes back to Laplace and his famous demon. The idea is that if a hypothetical entity knew the position and velocity of every single particle in the universe at one point in time, along with all the laws of physics, it could predict the entire past and future with perfect accuracy. In this scenario, your choice to eat a banana instead of an apple would not be a free decision, but simply the inevitable outcome of a chain of causes stretching all the way back to the beginning of the universe.
And even quantum physics, with its randomness at the atomic level, doesn't seem to solve this free will problem at our human scale, right?
Most philosophers and scientists agree that it doesn't. While quantum mechanics does introduce a fundamental unpredictability to the universe, this randomness occurs at a very small scale and doesn't seem to translate into meaningful freedom of choice for everyday decisions. Being governed by random events isn't the same as having free will.
This all leads us to the most sensitive question of all: morality and punishment in a deterministic world. If free will is an illusion, is it ever fair to praise or blame someone, reward or punish?
That's the most challenging implication. If our actions are not truly our own, then the very basis of our traditional notion of retributive justice, the idea that we punish someone because they deserve it, seems to crumble. The case of Charles Whitman, the University of Texas tower shooter who had a brain tumor pressing on his amygdala, illustrates this point well. Discovering the tumor doesn't justify his horrible acts, but it does change our perception of blame. It seems less like a purely evil act from a fully responsible individual and more like a terrible symptom of a physical problem. The same thing happened with that teacher who developed pedophilic urges because of a brain tumor.
Yeah, those cases raise an uncomfortable question. What makes a brain tumor so special? Our brains are always functioning according to physical and chemical laws, so maybe a neurological disorder is just a more visible example of the causal chains that lead to all of our actions. If we understand the brain better and better, aren't we just illuminating the areas where free will might have been hiding and coming to the conclusion that a criminal is just someone unlucky enough to be at the end of a causal chain that ends in a crime?
That's the line of thinking of many who doubt free will. Greg Caruso, for example, argues against retributive punishment and proposes a public health quarantine model of criminal justice. The idea would be to contain dangerous individuals to protect society, just as we isolate someone with a contagious disease, but without the intention of inflicting unnecessary suffering or punishing out of vengeance. The focus would be on rehabilitation and preventing crime in the first place.
But what about this idea that even if we don't choose our deeper impulses, we can choose not to act on them or even work to change our personalities? Wouldn't that be a form of freedom?
Determinists would say that even that capacity to change yourself is ultimately a product of prior causes, your genes, your life experiences, the current environment. You didn't choose to have the capacity to change. As Galen Strawson puts it, in the end, luck swallows everything.
That's a pretty bleak perspective, I have to admit. But it's surprising to know that most philosophers don't actually agree with this radical denial of free will. The majority lean towards compatibilism, right? To be clear, philosophers usually fall into two main camps in this debate: compatibilists, who believe that free will and determinism can coexist, and incompatibilists, who argued that they are mutually exclusive.
That's right. The majority of philosophers believe that determinism and free will are compatible. They argue that free will is not about having magical contracausal powers, but rather the ability to think about our desires, to reflect on them, and to act on them without being coerced by something external or by an internal compulsion. Think about your banana choice if you choose it because you like bananas. That's different than being forced to choose it at gunpoint or being compelled to grab it by an uncontrollable addiction. In both cases, your action is part of a causal chain, but in one of them, you are acting freely in the sense that matters.
So for compatibilists, what counts as free will worth having is this capacity for rational choice and reflection on our actions, like in the case of someone like Bernie Madoff, who knew what he was doing and chose to act that way.
Yes, that's their view. Now, incompatibilists would say this redefinition misses the point of what we intuitively mean by free will, that feeling that in the moment of choice, you could have genuinely done otherwise.
Speaking of that feeling, it's undeniable that most of us do have this experience of having free will. But Some people argue that if we look closer, this feeling itself might be an illusion.
Sam Harris is one of those who advocates this introspective view. He argues that if we pay close enough attention, we realize that our thoughts and intentions simply arise in our consciousness without us being the conscious author of them. He quotes Hume and Rimbaud, who describe this observation of the flow of thoughts without an internal commander.
And this belief that there's no free will, even if true, could it actually have negative social consequences, like we saw with those studies about increased cheating and decreased helping behavior?
There is that concern. But some free will skeptics argue that those studies might be misinterpreting determinism as fatalism. This idea that if we don't have free will, then our choices don't matter. Actually, even in a determined universe, our choices still have real consequences. Understanding determinism could even lead to positive outcomes like increased self-compassion, less anger towards others, and a recognition of the role of luck and circumstance in our lives. As Strawson puts it, the strawberries would still taste the same.
So to wrap up our exploration today, we have seen really contrasting views, from the outright denial of free will based on determinism to the compatibilists' attempts to reconcile the two and the challenges that neuroscience brings up.
Exactly. And the main takeaway for those who've been with us on this journey is to realize that this is a complex and ongoing discussion with profound implications for how we understand ourselves, morality, and society. Even if the ultimate nature of free will remains elusive, thinking about these different perspectives offers valuable insights.
And to leave you with something to chew on, I'll ask this. Thinking about everything we've discussed today, how might your understanding of personal responsibility and the actions of others shift, even if only a little? Keep thinking about that feeling of being in control and the forces that shape our choices. And with that thought-provoking question, we come to the end of another deep dive. See you next time.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.